Good evening, everyone. My name is Randy Sovich. I'm going to introduce the speakers tonight. First speaker is Roger Terrell. He's an architect and principal lecturer at the University of Portsmouth. His research and teaching are both focused on the study of architecture from a phenomenological and tectonic perspective, with particular reference to the philosophical, social, and cultural dimensions of the subject. He is the co-director of the Jorn-Utzon Research Network, which is focused on the interrogation of Utzon's work and design methodology and projecting discourse into contemporary architectural academic debate. His academic papers and conference papers focused upon the design methodology of Utzon and pedagogic theory. His most recent book, which I highly recommend, is Alto Utzon Fen, Three Paradigms of Phenomenological Architecture, examines the work of three seminal Nordic architects, Alvar Aalto, Jorn Utzon, and Sverre Fehn. I hope everyone's heard of those three architects, but I wonder. Anyway, he looks at them from a phenomenological perspective, utilizing the methodology of paradigm, or in the manner of. It's with great pleasure that I introduce Roger Terrell. Thank you.
Good evening. Thank you all for coming. It's very much appreciated. I'd just like to begin with a few thank yous. Sincere thanks to the AIA in Baltimore and also the Baltimore Architecture Foundation for this invitation. It's a kind of strange thing when you write a book. You send it to the publisher and then you have no idea where it goes. And about 6 months ago, an email from Randy dropped into my inbox saying, I've read your book, would you like to come and talk about it? And it felt a bit spooky, to be honest, in a lovely way. So after a whole load of Zooms and Skypes and so on, here I am. So thank you very much for that invitation. I'm not here perhaps so much to give a lecture as to tell a story, if that's okay with you. Is that okay? Good, excellent, okay. The title of this talk is Permeable Thresholds, and it's about reimagining paradigms of creative practice, paradigms of the world that we all exist in. This tale begins 60 years ago. The year was 1959. I was 3 years old, and I was under our dining table. This was not any old dining table, however. This was a table designed by Alvar Aalto, 1898 to 1976. To be more specific, the model number is posted on the slide. I often retreated under that table in my formative years. It was my cave. It was my world where imagination flourished, a territory largely impenetrable to adults, and that in all of my innocence I thought was secret. Under that table was a place to be, a place I later understood to be the primal essence of what it is to dwell poetically. It was retreat, it had prospect, and it had reason. And the reason is I needed to escape from the adult world. And of course, it was my first, and to date, my only Aalto dwelling. Now, given these beginnings, it's perhaps no surprise that I've been consistently intrigued by the Nordic world in all of its forms. Much later, as an architect and then academic, I began interrogating the work of Jorn Utzon, 1918 to 2008. And it soon became very clear that Utzon never subscribed to a particular theoretical position, or indeed was ascribed a particular theoretical position. And what really interested me is he was very, very skeptical about the over-theorization of architecture. Now, that discovery was kind of rather problematic for an academic striving to understand the nuances of the work of an architect who rejected actively a theoretical positioning. And over time, it became increasingly clear that Utzon was really interested in the experience of place. And he consistently looked upon the appearance of things in order to find essences. And as this experiential disposition of his work emerged through my research, it became appropriate to use a phenomenological lens to examine his work and his methodology. And indeed, that became the theoretical platform for the work. Now, the University of Portsmouth School of Architecture, where I once studied and now teach, has embedded within its pedagogy the concept of paradigm, which essentially means in the manner of. And it allows students to, it encourages students to gain a deep understanding of architecture and architects by exploring beyond mere image, by considering zeitgeists, relationships, methodologies, and devices employed by particular architects. So given the theoretical platform of phenomenology, this seemed to me to be a very appropriate methodology to employ for this research. But, and there's always a but, having established a theoretical platform and a methodology, there remained a huge territory to explore, and it was clear that further definition would be required. Excuse me. The etymology of the word architect is within two ancient Greek words, arche, meaning of the origin, and techne, meaning revealing by making. And these two words began to frame the study. However, the potential danger of categorization is always the loss of the big picture. And these two classifications alone struggled to capture the poetic qualities of Utzon's work, and I therefore added a third category, the poetic conjunction, that conjoins thinking, making, with the existential or poetic dimensions of architecture. And I continued to plough this furrow for about 15 years. I've tested the outputs at a number of conferences and through various pieces of academic writing, and a kind of consensus emerged that supported the philosophical platform as being appropriate to the subject. As the body of work built, I began to reflect upon the potential to extend the study forwards and backwards, capturing the heritage of Nordic architecture within which Utzon sat. And I subsequently refocused the research to include Alvar Aalto and Sverre Fehn, using the same methodology and the same philosophical platform. It soon emerged that there were some significant similarities in approach, although each of the protagonists held discrete and unique paradigmatic qualities. The lineage between them was clear. The output of what became some 20 years of research is within this book, Aalto, Utzon, Fehn, Three Paradigms of Phenomenological Architecture. Catchy, huh? I understand J.K. Rowling is shaking in her boots. And this book was published by Routledge, New York in March 2018. Subsequent reflection upon any singular and overarching quality holding our three protagonists together, I found myself increasingly fixating upon the word permeability. These were not men of silos and silo thinkers. These were individuals who travelled extensively, often, as Fehn once remarked, to discover that which has been forgotten. They were individuals who collaborated with each other, and many others, sharing knowledge and experience. And here my thinking extended further to a concern that had been growing in me for many years with regard to an apparent disconnection between academia and practice. I think the same is true in the States, but certainly in the UK. There is a steady flow of practitioners who teach part-time in schools of architecture, but very little noticeable flow in the opposite direction. Surely practitioners do not simply disconnect from academic thought upon qualification? Clearly not. But in talking to practitioner friends, it was clear that the luxury of academic discussions within the world of practice was often sacrificed at the altar of just getting stuff done. In an attempt to encourage greater permeability and movement between practice and academia, I formed an entity known as Cora. Cora is the feminine article of the ancient Greek word koros, which has been variously translated as room, territory, land, that later became to denote in its feminine form, Cora, a place or receptacle that revealed itself through the act of dance. The concept of a vessel or space in which something is revealed or comes into being is the essence of Cora. Now, there are some other interesting interpretations that ascribe a womb-like quality to Cora, providing perhaps a more human-centric and comprehensible definition. However, whichever interpretation is employed, I conceive of Cora as a permeable space in which things are revealed, or as I later described, a place where the as yet unimagined is revealed. That takes me to the theme of this lecture series, edges. This notion of permeability, for me, allows a possible recalibration of the word edge, moving from the rather binary condition of this or that, here or there, towards a more subtle understanding that is somehow more ambiguous, moving away from edge towards the concept of threshold. For me, the term threshold describes a point where an otherness begins to presence itself. It is not a boundary, it is not an edge, but presents itself to us as a liminal territory. Such ways of thinking are encouraged by the concept of permeability and are perhaps really acutely pertinent to cities that are adjacent to the sea, such as Baltimore and my own city, Portsmouth. Returning to the work of Cora, we're simply a network of makers and thinkers and doers across the world who collaborate either virtually or in reality upon specific projects as they emerge. Collaborators are invited on the basis of their expertise, which is needed within a specific project. We collaborate, and upon completion, we dissipate. Cora has no front office, it has no back office, it has no office. We're rather ship-like in that we drop anchor where we're required, and when appropriate, we up anchor and we sail away. Now, if all this sounds rather esoteric, I'd like to give you some diverse examples of Cora's activity over the last 2 years, which may have some resonance in the work that I'm very aware of that is going on currently in Baltimore. I'll begin with a collaboration with Pad Studio, a UK practice located on the coastal fringes of the New Forest on the south coast of the UK, in the delightful harbour town of Lymington. Now, Pad Studio have developed a reputation of responding sensitively to the unique qualities of place, designing projects that respond to and enhance the landscape, that are delivered with tectonic assurance and precision. They're a relatively small practice, but most members of the practice teach, and many teach part-time at Portsmouth. And we've all spoken for years about this schism between practice and theory, practice and academia. And we decided to collaborate on what was to become Cora's first project. It was agreed I would be employed to lead a structured event within the studio, the objective being to reveal, discuss, and review the values, ethos, and methodology of PAD Studio. We spent a day interrogating the overarching values of the practice and how those values were embedded within particular projects. And the only preordained output was that a piece of writing by Cora would in some way capture that conversation. As the day progressed and values and working methods emerged, at the end of the day, the appropriate genre of writing that would encapsulate both the tone and the content of the day was uncovered. And the genre chosen was the genre of manifesto. Considered appropriate, as any manifesto is, by definition, a forward projection of a current position. Furthermore, this was to be an emergent manifesto, capable of addition and adaptation as circumstances changed. The PAD Emergent Manifesto, and I think I've got just the first 7 points of a 26-point manifesto, is now a core element of the way that PAD communicates with its audience. It's central to their web presence, marketing, and social media. But perhaps most importantly is attracting clients who share PAD's values and their ethos. This is the first of a number of identity and branding exercises that Cora has collaborated upon with a number of UK practices. The second case study is a collaboration with an erstwhile postgraduate student, the founder of the London-based Simon Astridge Architecture Workshop. The workshop has a reputation for contemporary, largely residential high-end work, delivered again with tectonic precision using carefully crafted material. Simon was invited to develop a feasibility study for the reimagining of a once delightful courtyard house in Buckinghamshire, designed originally by the renowned architect, the late Richard Plinky. The house has suffered a number of thoughtless accretions that included roofing in of the original courtyard, and Cora supported in the workshop in the development and articulation of the narrative for the project that set out a process of revealing the origins of the house to its occupants through sensitive additions, also to reconnect the house to the lush landscape of the Chilterns. Our collaboration was later extended into the development and gaining of a planning approval, detailed design, material choice, and on-site delivery. And the project is due to be completed at the end of this month. The third collaboration I'd like to discuss briefly is with the renowned London architecture practice Carl Turner Architects. You may have seen this image before. The practice has a reputation for designing beautifully crafted materials, but in addition, they have a really interesting emerging reputation for repurposing redundant urban space and place through the incremental change that Carl has termed meanwhile architecture. Our collaboration was initially through supporting Carl and his team in revealing and articulating the identity of the practice. But it's not that I want to talk about now, but rather the potential that meanwhile architecture holds in shifting the paradigm of architectural interventions in urban settings that may well perhaps have application here in Baltimore. This is one of Carl's projects, Pop Brixton, in Brixton, South London. And what he is doing here is repurposing a piece of redundant and unloved urban space in London. Brixton is a mainly residential, multi-ethnic community which has had in the past some quite significant history of racial tensions. And Pop Brixton is conceived as actually a micro-city of culture, enterprise, and community. And here, Carl Turner acted as architect, developer, curator, and in part investor, and it was informed by the push-pull philosophy of Carl Turner's practice. He believes that most urban interventions are pushed upon communities, whereas he encourages the communities to pull action from redundant space. I'm sorry this slide is really unclear, but what Carl does very cleverly is he collects data, because it's that data that has the capacity to convince funding authorities to second-level invest in projects, third-level invest in projects. So, for example, Pop Brixton went from a footfall of 0 to a footfall of 1.7 million people in the first 2 years of operation. And now it's a really thriving hub, providing significant economic regeneration to what has been quite a challenging area of South London. Now, this meanwhile philosophy acknowledges the challenge of funding socially responsive projects from traditional funding sources. Cora has, in collaboration with Studio Pad, an architectural practice from Southampton, adopted this meanwhile concept in a series of commissions from Go Southampton, a business improvement BID organisation. Now, in the UK, central government provides sorely needed grant funding through these bid organisations across the country to provide funding for economic and social betterment projects in deprived urban areas. So Go Southampton has a two-part mission: to enhance the urban environment and increase footfall in the city. Southampton is located at the centre of the south coast of England, its waters sheltered by the offlying Isle of Wight. Southampton has many parallels with Baltimore, it being a city port within which the relentless increase in containerised shipping has resulted in the loss of thousands of jobs over the years. The consequence has been the rise in the scale of economic and social deprivation within the city. We've been commissioned to do 4 discrete yet interconnected pieces of work within the city. We're currently developing design briefs for vinyl graphics for windows of vacant retail space based upon a number of urban themes. We're developing a brief for an urban planting project which aligns and complements the vinyl projects. We're designing a brief for a forthcoming international design competition that focuses upon the urban spine of the city. The final commission seeks to identify and enhance vacant urban space in the city and is an exemplar of the Meanwhile project. The project has a working title of Between Spaces, Between Places. We seek to raise awareness of, firstly, the presence of vacant urban space in the city and encourage public engagement through a few provocative acts to encourage meaningful public participation in reimagining these spaces. Our first act has been tiny, to rebrand the Go Southampton brand as a Meanwhile concept. The second act has also been of very small scale. And that is simply to buy a pre-used container and through a school's design competition, decorate it. The container is then located and relocated on vacant spaces across the city and becomes the nexus of community engagement and participation. A number of design charrettes are anticipated to actively foster public engagement. And of course, within the Meanwhile philosophy, the next steps are as yet unimagined. But such is the potency of the Meanwhile process, rather than pushing urban interventions on the city, we seek to pull, to draw upon the vast human resources of this ethnically diverse place. I think there are many parallels between Baltimore and Southampton in terms of shared contexts and shared challenges. And I hope perhaps this might be the beginning of a much longer and deeper transatlantic conversation. So, in conclusion, it's been a somewhat complex journey from Finland to Baltimore. traversing 2 centuries in just 20 minutes. I've tried to illuminate the idea that permeability has efficacy at many levels. At a personal level, in terms of individual ways of being in the world. At a collective level, in revealing ourselves and to others, our values and ethos, and in collaboration between creative practices that develops an energy and a self-fulfilling impetus. And finally, at an urban scale, permeability allows meanwhile interventions to grow and to flourish. Cora's role in all this is to facilitate, encourage, provoke, support, and question. And perhaps in our increasingly flat, horizontal, fluid world, we need to think differently, act differently, and be differently. And in closing, I leave you with the table under which all this began. Thank you.
Thank you, Roger. Our next speaker is Katie O'Meara. Katie O'Meara is a registered architect, researcher, and professor of architectural design at MICA. She's also a landscape architect. I guess we're going to say that again later. She has pursued collaborative research projects around the world, initiated student programs, and designed solutions that bring together architecture, landscape, and geography to address significant social problems. Her current area of study focuses on the critical interface between rivers and cities and the increasingly critical link between distressed populations and environmental changes. During a recent sabbatical, Katie earned her master's degree in landscape architecture at the University of Pennsylvania. Her design proposal, Mumbai Infrastructure as Architecture, received a National Honor Award from the American Society of Landscape Architects. Katie received her master's in geography from Towson University and bachelor's in architecture from the University of Notre Dame. And many, many years ago, we both entered a competition called the Steedman, and she did really, really well. Please welcome Katie O'Meara.
That was a while ago. Thank you, Randy, and thank you, Baltimore Architecture Foundation and the AIA. It is, just going to get my little timer started here. Okay. It was the prompting of being invited to give this talk that I took the turn of looking at my work, which has become the scale of cities or half a city or very large terrains, and I wanted to bring it back to the architectural scale. I started pursuing geography and landscape architecture because, to me, it became important to consider the public realm. I felt that as a practicing architect, my work really concentrated from the property lines in, and we exist in the spaces between property lines. Originally, I suppose I thought I could develop an architectural practice of the public realm. It continued to scale and work in larger areas, geographies, and geologies. And so this has been an opportunity to really think again about that public room that we're talking about and that we just heard so much thoughtful reflection on from Roger. So I think as architects, we all strive for creating a quality of place, something magical. And the test for me, the benchmark I hold for that quality, is a space on the left. I was up on a terrace, an upper terrace, and watched school children come and visit this site. And as they landed on the lower terrace platform, they began to spin and dance. I realized this amazing space created dance, and that was a benchmark for me as a phenomenal place. And on the right, we have the Inner Harbor at Baltimore. So these are two places that engage people and where people really interact with the room quality of the environment. Context is something as well. The space on the left is the most public realm of the Sumela Monastery in the hillside region above the city of Trebizond on the Black Sea coast. A fairly isolated experience, so to come to a hard paved public space is a real change of context. The Inner Harbor of Baltimore is at the water's edge of a growing and changing city. And the places are fundamentally quite different. The water's edge here at the Inner Harbor now is very much a touristic environment. It was deliberately developed or redeveloped to attract tourism as industry, and the waterfront now reflects that business. When Chris Streb spoke a couple of weeks ago, he showed a map that showed how much the water line had changed in the several hundred or dozens of years. I'm actually not sure what his time frame was. The water line itself changed a lot over time, and what I realized is the water line alone didn't change. The city changed, and the waterfront and the water line changed with the city. So our relationship to the waterfront has been evolving since the founding of the city itself. I would like to share a number of historical maps, and I have geo-referenced these. These are technically precisely aligned in mapping software with the city boundary of the current Baltimore City, which is the line in blue. And for reference of scale, the yellow intersection is the current Pratt and Charles Street, the early Pratt and Charles as well, to a certain degree. This is the extent of Baltimore in 1782. And again, in 1792. I want to capture some image of the waterfront and the vessels to give some sense of the time frame in which Baltimore's waterfront has been evolving. In 1800, the population of the city was 13,500. In 1797, the first U.S. constellation was built at Harris Creek. In 1801, the population was 26,500, so almost double in 10 years. And in 1913, a view from Federal Hill shows the changing technology and the growing city. By 1916, the city was looking to expand along any number of these outer boundaries. Between 1910 and 1920, so around the 1916 time slot, the population went from 560,000 to 730,000. And with each of these changes in technology, industry, and population, the waterfront changed as well. This is a picture from 1942, when the population was 860,000. In 1945, the Baltimore Planning and Development Commissioners commissioned a study on the city. What they show, and what's compelling to me about this map, is they show a continuity of substandard dwelling, a continuity of blighted or what I suppose we call now underrepresented neighborhoods. But this is one of a series of maps in this report. This tones in this instance represent areas in which 20% or more of the dwellings have no bathrooms or are in need of repair. This is showing where monthly rents are under $25 per dwelling. What is most compelling to me is the continuity west and south Baltimore, east and up along past Jewett Park into the area where Johns Hopkins is. So the poorer communities were geographically contiguous. And any number of attributes of the housing stock were evaluated in this proposal. This is a map of changes in property value from losses of 5 to 10%, gains of 5 to 10%, gain of 10 to 40% in that area. And in 1959, another view from Federal Hill, and another study. This is a study of the, prepared by the Baltimore Lutheran Planning Group that was in Chicago. This is a document from the Baltimore City Planning Library. I'm not clear exactly on who commissioned this study, but this shows the study from 1960 and 61 based on the demographics of the people, not the housing stock. This is a map showing socioeconomic levels by quintile, where the center, again, a continuous distribution of poverty at the center with concentric rings of increasing wealth moving to the outward areas. This shows the percent public school pupils who are Negro in 1960. Again, we have a geo-referenced map, so we understand the location and place against contemporary maps that we have. This is a distribution of the non-white population, and this looks like it's using the census data of 1950. This is a demarcation showing 3 major Negro points of entry into Baltimore City. Enter the Metro Center and Charles Center development plan. It says, although it envisages a vastly changed Baltimore by 1990, you can't call it a plan, it's a suggestion, a challenge. And this is the footprint of the Charles Center. One of the reasons I sort of excavated this material is because a public space like the Inner Harbor can't really stand on its own without the draw of a new development model and new commercial properties like Charles Center. The Inner Harbor would probably have very little chance of surviving, let alone thriving. This is some more images of the plan prepared at the time to make presentations and pitch the idea. This is the highway coming through that inspired Federal Hill and Fells Point to join forces and create a combined historic society or organization. And this is the Charles Center project site area and the Inner Harbor site here. The highway should be shown running through, but the water layer from the contemporary map has overlaid that. So what I want to talk about is how the Urban Renewal Center, the Urban Renewal Project for Charles Center changed the character of Baltimore City and its population and created edges that had not been present before. This is a geo-reference map of that renewal plan. Renewal plans are legislated. So these documents are from the City Hall Legislative Library. And just so you know, They're not always super organized, and because they have many amendments to them, it's not always clear that you're getting the original plan. Wherever possible, I'll use the original plan done in the time of the Charles Center piece in the early 60s, but the documents have a wide-ranging history of dates. And I'll go through these urban renewal plans and I'm going to show them geographically, not chronologically, but the dates are provided here. This is the urban renewal plan footprint, geo-referenced onto this map, and that was passed into legislation in 1964. The Inner Harbor East footprint is here, and that was legislated in 1976. The Sharp Leadenhall and Inner Harbor West are the plans coming to the south of the Inner Harbor, and 1971 and 78 respectively. And Washington Village and Ridgely's Delight, you can see the boundary moving up and across to the west. Fremont, forming the base of Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard, coming in here. Market Center was passed into legislation in 1977. And Charles Center, which is perhaps the smallest among them, in 1959. Each of these planning projects are associated with a large number of acquisitions and demolition and rezoning. Usually many hundred, 500 is probably a small planning project. But again, the documents in the library are a little bit scattered in that regard. So we have the dozen or so urban renewal plans going into clearing the area into which the jewels of the Charles Center and the Inner Harbor can be situated. On the left is the urban renewal plan and the contemporary vacancies. Those are vacant buildings and lots. They are nearly exactly outside the established urban renewal boundary set into motion in 1959. While these documents are plans, and they often state noble intentions, and we can't necessarily attribute to them any sort of ill will, we can see from, instead of looking forward as plans do, that we can look back. The following is a sequence of vacancy and concentrations of African Americans and high poverty counts from 1940, 1960, 1990, and 2010. So the patterns of high isolation and the accompanying challenges and devastation that contributes to a community turn out that they were not always that way. We always hear the city talking about the butterfly effect of poverty, and I would argue that that was created and that that we have some responsibility for righting that wrong. There's a disparity of water and wealth, and I think the new mission on equity that the city reflects in all of its new plans should be brought to bear on bringing equity and new opportunities to the areas of Baltimore that were sacrificed in the becoming of the tourist center of the Inner Harbor. The Inner Harbor was built during the onset of the emergence of the National Flood Program, and they were very eager to build and not get bogged down in legislation. Yeah. Robust. Whoa. Not robust. Can we have slides back? I don't know if that was me, and I don't know if someone's still back there. Oh, you're right here. Okay. Yeah, I think it was my notes. Kerfluffled. Great. Thank you. Thank you, Scott. So, Baltimore's development favors waterfront property of almost every kind. On the Baltimore development site for developers, there are 15 to 20 opportunities on the harbor and almost none within the neighborhoods or very small projects. Yet these growing isolated and distressed communities are on higher ground. The waterfronts flood and the blighted areas do not. So I would like to acknowledge the city's statements on equity, using the equity lens, and that we should all become familiar with the new sustainability plan, recognize they're reaching out to us and everyone in the community about participating, and that we start to take part in these kind of opportunities that I think are more open now than they have been in the past. Because of this disparity of income, wealth, and access, I have been proposing what I call higher ground, a vision plan for social and environmental resilience. The idea is to encourage us to address the blighted areas and stop skirting them or walling them in. We've gone from creating edges from keeping them out to edges of keeping them within their own communities, and it's been extremely detrimental. The increased risk of flooding due to much more intense rain events and climate change have promoted more concern about flooding. So now is the time that we could address the blighted area distress and the environmental distress of flooding simultaneously. In collaboration with hydrologists and flood modelers from George Mason University and Johns Hopkins, I've had MICA interns develop flood modeling to look at the West Baltimore area. We worked from an actual flood event of Hurricane Agnes, which is the worst ever seen, and then developed flooding scenarios at 10% intervals. And what you see is that while the industrial park does get its share of water, the west side is dry. It's not that they don't have other types of flooding events, but those are due more to failing infrastructure than rain events. So the higher ground proposal is a set of ideas. Its intention is to create a place upon which communities, individuals, and institutions can help to realize their own vision, how their individual communities can participate and also become a part of a larger scheme. It's a sequence of paired propositions of commercial and industrial development to bring jobs in. The isolation of the blighted areas and the underserved communities also came together with a displacement of where the work is, which is in the county, and where the people who need the jobs are. So average travel times to work here can be over 2 hours, where in more affluent areas are under 45 minutes. So combining a an industrial jobs-based center with a landscape component to reduce the flooding events would be phase one. Phase two would be to create a buffer and a bike route or other kind of transportation route along the industrial area and linking to the jobs already here and into access to other communities. A series of internal neighborhood parks would also be a part of the plan because greening, environmental resilience, climate change, and so forth need to be addressed at the community level and what is more or less right outside your door. Again, this is an idea to create a conversation where communities can come together and think about what they would like to see and how the spaces could be used, in addition to providing performance for stormwater management and mitigating the worst hazards of the more severe flood events. Phase three is a new greenway stream toward the mid-zone of the community with a series of mixed-use developments along the Route 70 corridor or trough and the University of Maryland Medical Center. Phase four, the idea that we could have waterfront properties, but they would reach into the communities instead of creating walls and walling out communities, and that they could be part of a water management, rainwater management system. At the time of this completion of this scheme, our collaborators at George Mason and our hydrologists were still trying to marry the riverine flooding with the sea level rise, and that's still a work in progress. There's not really sufficient data to model those as accurately as we'd like, but we get some sense of what could happen and how we could create more diaphanous or permeable landscapes for increased water events. Phase five is along the Martin Luther King Boulevard. These greenways that are running north-south are all on buried streams that are already here. And the idea is that you would work on the project until it was complete, rather than thinking, well, we've got 20 sites there, we can take down 15 buildings, or we can create 5 vacant lots from falling down buildings. Could we make an approach as committed and rigorous as the Charles Center project and actually work on the blighted communities in an inclusive and multi-income way until the work is done, until they are desirable, self-sufficient, and provide home and work and recreational space for people of every income and race. This completed project addresses over 21,000 vacant sites. That's 2/3 of the city's total. It's not meant to be something that we dictate to anyone. It's meant to create a place to make a discussion and a conversation and to start to realize we could actually address these piece by piece if we made the commitment to do it. One of the reasons I talk about the urban renewal plans and show them alongside the vacancy as if suggesting cause is because we may be more inclined to solve a problem that we took the ownership of causing. The strategic development can also, be done in conjunction with people modeling vacancy and finding ways to interrupt the sort of mushrooming effect of vacancy, which there are a number of mathematicians at Hopkins working on that. And this is really also a pilot to bring research collaboration into practice, not a divide easily crossed, certainly not crossed back and forth. And more work needs to be done on the flood modeling as well. Again, the information is sparse. Flood modeling, especially the HEC-RAS Army Corps modeling that my student used, is typically used to solve the flooding at a culvert. So trying to anticipate flooding over a full urban terrain is challenging its boundaries of performance. This project has been funded in part by a National Science Foundation grant, which I've been collaborating on for about 4 years. It's in hot water and harm's way. The PI is Dr. Seth Geikema, and co-authors are Benjamin Zaitchik from Hopkins. Celso Ferreira is the storm surge modeler. Esther Kim is a MICA student who did the ocean, or the flood modeling. And Jahan Sumi, Jahan Sumi helped her with that. She's a student at George Mason. And Maria O'Mara, Matt Baker, and Claire Moriarty participated in writing and reviewing text. So, thank you.
That one's working. Some of yours.
No?
Yeah. Yep.
Now mine's working. Hi.
Me too.
Thank you. I'm Eric Shore. I'm also on the lecture committee, and I want to thank again Katie O'Meara and Roger Terrell for sharing their insights. And we'd love to now open it up to questions to start a dialogue and get some of your questions answered. I will ask, please, that if you have a question, when I indicate you, wait for the microphone to come over. We're recording all of the audio to include in the video, and also because it's a great thing to have a record of. So please do be patient. When I call on you, the microphone will get there very quickly, and that way everyone can hear and all of time can hear. So with that, does anyone have any questions? Yeah, right here in front. It's coming around.
Hi, is it on? Okay, sounds like it's on. Hi, I'm Ruth from Architecture at Morgan, and I had a question for Roger. I might be more of a comment than a question, but I really appreciated you calling attention to the gap between what AIA National likes to call the academy, and the rest of us just call architecture school, and practice and practitioners. And as someone who's been in the university setting, I know there are a lot of practical obstacles to really vigorously integrating architects into our programs, because university culture is more and more focused on PhD and tenure, and architecture schools don't really fit that well into these university protocols. But I thought it was interesting how you suggested academics could go into the offices more, so that that reverse direction could happen more. So any more comment or dialogue about that gap is my question.
Thank you, Ruth. My sense is there are several layers to that. It's only a personal view, but increasingly I feel that many schools of architecture have some degree of discomfort within university context. That may be a kind of statement of heretical proportions, I don't know, but my sense is that many universities, because of the sheer scale of their operation, are kind of silo-like in their quality. They're very difficult to penetrate, and they're very difficult to kind of move out of in any meaningful sense. So to be direct with you, what I've done is I've basically moved down to a part-time contract to allow me to work within this core entity, because I felt it was really important that it wasn't bounded by what I think are quite outdated ways of thinking about the relationship between academia and practice. I don't know, does that answer your question in part, maybe? Okay.
Katie, anything to?
Don't do anything rush.
No's okay.
Yeah, no, sorry. It's
I think
a
it's
challenge.
working.
It's a challenge. I think the perspectives are different, and maybe more so the metrics. So how one is encouraged to spend one's time and makes it hard to find the right path. I mean, I think with the collaborators that I work with, many of them are practitioners, and it's hard to find a way to implement the research and practice. I think it's time, basically, yeah.
Anyone else? Oh, Randy?
Roger and Kathleen, or Katie, excuse me. Kathleen's here. We toured the city today, Roger, and in the sort of the seeing the city versus the data that Katie's kind of presented. What do you see that's different from what you saw, or that it reinforces it, and how would that maybe be connected back to Southampton and Portsmouth, and I guess maybe some conversation could happen between the two.
I don't know if any of you know of an Australian architect called Rick Laplastriere. Have you come across him? No? No? Okay. Great big bear of a guy in his 80s, worked extensively with Glenn Murcutt, and the UK RRBA presented him with the gold medal some, I don't know, 3 or 4 years ago. And he came into London to receive that gold medal and gave a talk upon presentation about London's watercourses. Now, Rick spends a lot of time in the bush, and he kind of navigated London through its topography, finding ancient watercourses which are now culverted and hidden and had kind of lost their meaning. And it was a fascinating way of understanding a city. And my sense is that Southampton, Portsmouth, Baltimore, and a lot of other CH cities are facing, really kind of common challenges. I found Katie's analysis really, really fascinating, particularly the piece about going back, looking at historic conditions and understanding why they were as they were. And in some senses, I may have misinterpreted, and if I have, say so, please, but in some senses, I felt that much of your work was around rediscovering those ancient water patterns and ways in which fluids flow, and the potential of not controlling water, but harnessing it in its potential, but certainly acknowledging its incredible power.
Yes, and also a lot of benefit of working on these plans is collaborating with the green space and the parks and people and so forth. And I have a number of ways of proposing greening, and I don't think there's just one, and that greening can be many different things and serve many purposes. The real mission for me to propose greening is to talk about a productive landscape that's not housing, with over 20,000 vacants, it's still very hard for the city to imagine putting in anything but housing. So greening along a boulevard might make sense, greening from school to school. When I was discussing this with Miriam Avens of the Baltimore Green Space, she's like, where's the water coming from? I thought, fire hydrant, of course. And yeah, she directed me to the historic stream layer, which underlies everything. It's topography. You could address flooding that way. It's organized and it's a system. So I have looked at ways to, using the modern mapping software, select vacants within 1,000 feet of a historic stream. Let's start with those. They're at the low-lying area, and it makes sense to do so. So it's been an interesting perspective, as I think it often is when you take two disparate systems and look at one through the lens of the other. So looking at housing through the lens of historic stream has been interesting.
And I think it raises lots of really interesting questions which may coalesce with the kind of meantime thinking. I don't know how it is here in the States. I mean, I've kind of got a view maybe, but certainly within the UK you might have noticed our political class are in somewhat confusion. And it's true. And the notion of the scale of phased intervention that you're suggesting, which I think is, amazing, would be untenable in current UK conditions. They wouldn't even envisage moving towards phase one, because for 7 years we've been under this process of austerity. What I find intriguing is how we can get from where we are to phase one. And that may mean, we've got an overarching strategy, we know kind of where we want to head for, and every kind of intervention is then measured against that ambition, however small it might be.
I think with the work I do, and one of the reasons I teach is because I can do this work. When you do work that's not expected, and it's not, funding stream hasn't provided for it because it hasn't been envisioned, you won't get paid to do it because no one thought of it, so they didn't think to put it in a budget. And when you invite groups and people to think of something different, you're going to be putting food on the table a different way. So that's one relationship of the Academy supporting this kind of work. And what I'm trying to do is fill a gap. Many agencies won't engage an idea they can't pay for, which means we're limited to thinking about what we've already got funding for, and we're stuck. If where we were amazing, that would be a perfect way to go. We'd be staying in the same great place. But we're stuck in not such a great place. So I want to say that there is a possibility that this could happen. And you need the bigger framework. If you start with one small project and it's not a part of a bigger whole, you could never get there. I don't actually think the best way would be to implement like rolling it out like railroad. But the vision needs to be provided, and each community could understand they're part of a bigger component. And that's the piece that people don't do. And most, even planning offices don't work at the scale of West Baltimore. So I see it as filling a gap in that area, rather than being a mission plan that we should get started with.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, I really liked Roger's concept of the meanwhile concept, and what, because particularly when you compare it with Katie's analysis of all the urban renewal plans, which were these top-down plans that represented a certain fixed status that one was aspiring to, and in some cases actually achieved, then we are now in this phase where the meanwhile and the temporary and the more ephemeral bottom-up way of changing things is much more promising partly because the governance doesn't have the wherewithal to do anything else, and partly because the top-down plans really failed. So I'm wondering, though, if one takes the higher ground plan, whether that's not also a kind of plan that projects a future that is rather fixed. I mean, with these figures on how the water reached inland and all that, and whether when I know that we did the network plan, the green network plan just finished last year, I suppose you worked with the planning department somewhat on that green network plan, which was essentially a plan that had the meanwhile aspect in it, because it started with very small intervention, that you take the row houses that you tear down and you make them into a green network. To expand that into a hydraulic system wouldn't be all that difficult, but I don't see any connection between that green network plan as it is published and your higher ground plan. So if you could maybe explain that a bit, and how you would pick up on Roger's aspect of the meanwhile.
One thing I learned about making architectural and planning drawings is they're not always the drawing you're making to build this scheme. They're instructional, informational, and inspirational. So I think what's missing, which I was trying to describe before, is some notion that something could ever be cohesive and coherent. So that's one piece. And this is I could imagine that the Green Network Plan would aspire to this, and that it was underfunded and done in components. It's a set of components. I think there's also a lot more information in the Green Network data than is in the publicly presented plans. So there's a lot of hydrology in the background work, and I think it purposely had to be made small and manageable. There are something like 5 key sites or 5 hubs or something like that, which I don't think 5 hubs is satisfactory to address the scale of the problem. I also think the top-down method won't happen, won't be funded, and won't be supported, that the work does need to have individual components and be supported by communities. So think of this as a framework for discussion rather than a renewal plan for legislation.
I think for me, the meanwhile paradigm also has a level of empowerment attached to it. To give you an example, we were working with a small community church organization on Sunday afternoon with a kind of workshop which was focused around a 1950s neo-Gothic church that had been redundant for 15 years. When I first saw it, it was filled with pews and dust, and there were pigeons in there. It was a hell of a mess. And we suggested this process of kind of consultation with the church community, but also the wider community. So we held a workshop last Sunday afternoon. The transformation that community had made within just a few weeks was amazing. So we had a redundant church with bouncy castles. There was a shooting gallery, a Skeletrix track. There was a kiddies ball pool. There was a bring and buy thing going on. There was a coffee stall happening. And all of this energy was, the impetus was the possibility to enact change in a manner that was kind of owned rather than imposed. Mm. And we did a kind of De Bono's 6 thinking hats exercise across the afternoon. And the way that people were communicating was just astonishing. And all of a sudden you have a sense that Actually, all that's required is some attitude that says there's belief, and that belief becomes empowerment, and the empowerment then becomes change. And all Cora has done to date is to rebrand that community organisation, that community church. So my sense is that the inaction of tiny things can lead to very big things as long as you know where you're trying to get to.
Mm-hmm.
Roughly, at least.
It can also act as a catalyst for the pull instead of the push that you've been talking about.
Hi, Lori Rubling. Thank you, Katie. Very exciting. But Roger, my question is for you, and I'm curious about, you're talking about paradigm changes, right? And the intervention of branding a space. Is that architecture to you now? Or how has, I'm wondering how your understanding of an architectural practice might be evolving now through Cora.
That's a very interesting question. For reasons of client confidentiality, I can't identify the practice, but I've been having a really interesting conversation for about 6 months with a practice very renowned within the UK, but they're thinking about walking away from the word architect. And I found that really very interesting because they're positing the notion that architecture has become, certainly in the UK, both exclusive and excluding. And there is no doubt that to employ an architect under the historic kind of patterns of procurement, you need to have some significant levels of wealth. Now, in cities like London, that can be okay. Well, I don't think it's okay anywhere, but it can be deliverable because of the equity that one might have in your property value, because of the escalation in property values within conurbation. But for many, many people in the UK, particularly since the loss of public sector housing, the ability to engage with architects and architecture is diminishing hugely. And that concerns me a huge amount, but I sense that there are a whole bunch of architects who are thinking in similar ways. We might not quite be sure what the new paradigms are, but these people are really testing some very interesting boundaries. So I'm working with architects who are architects and makers, but they don't describe themselves as their strapline as being architects. They might be innovators, they might be designers. And I think that also there is a view within architecture in the UK that our professional body has become less relevant, because we have a very centric professional body organisation. Although we have branches, regional branches, we only have one building, and that's in central London. It's in an area of London which is incredibly pricey if you want to buy real estate there, and that kind of says a lot about what's happening. For me anyway.
I think one potential change of the paradigm that I teach to is working with students who want to create change. So rather than the model of going to work in a practice and having the practice take on clients and the clients being developers making bigger decisions maybe than we're aware of, that individuals are creating, becoming change agents. I think there's an aspect, getting back also to Klaus's question and comment, is that the 5 phases that I show are shown to point out that you could address all the vacants. There's a whole other set of work, and I've done different plans called a Mosaic Approach, or what if you hit these triggers, or how could 5 centers generate change? And I think there are many, many different studies that we could look at if you put a seed project or a meanwhile space here, what could coalesce around it? And but you want to get to some sense of greater stability across the whole texture of of the neighborhood, I think.
Yeah, and I remember my professor when I was a student used to have this phrase. He said, "Scientists are here to explain the world. Architects are here to change it." It's quite a kind of pithy phrase, I think. He was very direct.
Anyone? Oh, here, front and center.
Thank you. My name's Fred Heiser. I'm an architect in town, and I want to commend both of you for the work that you've been doing. I specifically, though, wanted to talk to Katie about the plans that you presented to us tonight. And for one thing, I wanted to express my total shock over the increasing despair that the maps that you presented to us as a city and what that represents, especially in light of what's happening in our city nationally. And I think that the plans that you are proposing and the things that you're looking at are so very real and necessary for the survival of not only our city, but many other Rust Belt post-industrial places. My question, I guess, is how does this plan, or how do we as professionals affect our leaders and our decision makers and try to encourage some of the development away from the White L and the Inner Harbor East and the Port Covingtons, the exclusive, and how do we really get people back on the streets the way they did in the 70s and the 80s, the thing that encouraged me to leave Washington, D.C. and come here, because the authenticity of that.
When you figure that out, tell me. I think it's shocking, but what I've shown has been true for a long time. And that's one of the reasons I emphasize the geo-referenced mapping, is that it's precise, and it's the power of mapping. When you see them together, it's shocking. It's hard to stay encouraged, but I think the environment around these things is changing. I think we're starting, the leadership is starting to take ownership, and I think it's literally unsustainable to maintain the poverty as we maintain it, and it is maintained, and to continue to expect the city to be attractive. The city, I think, has a position that to offset the poverty as it exists, and we're leaving it, we need to get higher and higher incomes. We need to sell a $2 million condo to offset 6 or 12 blocks in the ghetto. And I think we need to appeal to a rising working class and a middle class and stop trying to overshoot, because the disparity is worse for the lower income people. And I think attitudes are changing. The new sustainability plan has an invitation to participate, and I think that's what we need to do. I've met with the director of sustainability this week and the new head of planning, and I'm working on it, and I think I need a bigger voice. And so what we can do collectively to take ownership and talk about accountability and basically give permission to act instead of permission to not act, because not doing it seems to have worked okay for most. And it's creating a lot of strife that we don't always associate with the actions that we've taken historically.
I couldn't agree more. And if I may, I'd like to be the purveyor of a little bit of good news. And that is today, apparently the UK government voted that they recognise there is a climate emergency. Yes! But but that raises a question. Okay, you know, recognising it is one thing, doing something about it is another thing. But my guess is that that vote went through because in the UK and across the world, school children have been going on strike. And a young 16-year-old Scandinavian girl spoke at Davos and spoke at a whole load of other venues of positions of power and actually challenged authority. And on the basis of that, all of this other stuff rolled out. If you add to that the protests on the streets in the UK over Brexit, whatever one's position, one has a sense at least it's galvanised some kind of response, and perhaps has in a way re-politicised a whole bunch of people that had previously lost confidence in the realm of politics for all kinds of complex reasons. So I'm an optimist. I think there is hope, and often it comes from the least expected quarter. You know, that little 16-year-old kid who could believe the kind of power that she kind of motivated, the energy she motivated by just words. And I think that's an astonishing kind of learning potential for all of us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think maybe many people have changed a little bit, and if we can harness that much change, I think we have a lot of capacity. I'm optimistic too, or I wouldn't even try, really, but keep looking for the tipping point, looking for the change. Recognize, I mean, equity is the biggest issue that the climate emergency is going to drive home. And the openness of the equity lens in all the city plans is important. And I think, sometimes I think even the people in charge aren't really sure how to do it next. So it takes more than any single individual to figure it out and get it to move forward. And I think they are well intended. And I think with each of the people I've met in different realms, none of them they all recognize the problem and want their work to make meaningful contributions, and no one has enough lever to make the change that they need to make. So every agency comes short of creating the whole net. And that's where I think our institutions can help. And I think, again, these groups and decision makers, along with communities, are probably more inclined to participate in finding a solution than they were 5 years ago, I think.
My sense that needs to be a kind of multi-agency, multi-dimensional approach. I was captivated by your kind of imagining drawings. And I wonder what those places would be, how beautiful they could be. Because, you know, I could imagine that at one level, you know, you're addressing that issue, you know, regarding flooding and hard surface and permeable surface and so on. But I also have a sense those spaces could be wonderful places to ride a bicycle or take your kids and have a picnic. And I just wonder if there isn't another level that we need to engage at, which is how we can visualize these wonderful opportunities that you're describing in a manner that, you know, the whole population can enjoy. And I don't mean that in a patronizing sense at all, but I'd love to see three-dimensional representations or imaginings of some of those spaces, because I think they could be absolutely astonishing. You know, that liminal territory between water and land, I think is hugely filled with potential.
Sounds like a great idea for a competition entry. I think those are great points to sort of release everyone back into the city here. But before we do, first I'd like to thank both Katie O'Meara and Roger Tyrrell one more time.
Thank you. Thank you.